Closing statements from all six panelists now, 2 minutes each, and then we'll have you vote on these arguments that you've heard, starting with a panelist against the motion Islam is dominated by extremists, Reza Aslan.
I guess the question has to be, once again, what exactly are these radicals dominating? Asra Nomani has said that they're dominating action. That is demonstrably false, because that would mean that what we're seeing in every country in the Muslim world is this radical collective action, which of course takes part in political violence, in terrorism, which is simply not true. I mean, that's demonstrably false. That is not the majority of the actions that we're seeing. Paul Marshall has said that it is the states that Islam is or radical are dominating. That again is demonstrably false. Besides the fact that 1/3 of the Muslim world lives in democracy, besides the fact that of the most populous Muslim countries in the world, Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Lebanon, Senegal, these are all quite successful democratic states, and that in those countries that we do see a real sort of movement of political, one could even say radical Islam, they're all in response to secular autocracies in which the mosque is the only free space in society and the only opposition is religious opposition. David has said it's the institutions that the Muslims are radicaling. This again is demonstrably false. The Iman Declaration, 170 of the world's leading clerics and scholars representing every single sect and schism of Islam came together, issued fatwas outlawing violence in the name of Islam, outlawing calling anyone a takfir or an apostate. The same thing happened in the Mecca Declaration a year after that. The same thing happened just earlier in this year with the King of Jordan. So in every single one of these issues, the idea that something is being dominated is demonstrably false. So we can talk about our sort of visions about what Islam brings up, the visions of warfare and them, but the fact is, when you think about it in its historical sense, in its factual, objectifiable, observifiable sense, it just doesn't make any sense.
Thank you, Reza Aslan, for your closing statement. Paul Marshall, arguing in favor of the motion.
Okay. Yes, we do argue it is the question of institutions, who is controlling organizations. Of course, one of those major and most powerful of those organizations is states, though not just them. We've spoken not just about Saudi Arabia, we've spoken about Iran. Compared the situation of 30 years ago, with a radical Islamic regime, you basically just had the Saudis, at least a large one. Then you had Iran. Then you've had Sudan. Then you've had radicalization in Pakistan, which has continued. You've had events in Somalia. You've had events in Nigeria. If you look at places where more radical movements are not per se the government, but are increasingly influencing it and are more powerful and establish themselves as the opposition, we see this in Egypt. We see this in Algeria. We see this in Malaysia. We see this in Indonesia. And in each of those countries, we see an increase of violence. So in each of these settings, compare the situation 20 years ago and the situation now. If you look at movements amongst Muslims, say amongst the Palestinians, amongst the Chechens, around Kashmir, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Lebanon, you've had movements there opposing the government. Usually it was in terms of national liberation or political freedom or access to resources. Now in each of those, a shift towards a more radical Islamic emphasis. We see this across the board in setting after setting. It is now more radical than it was then. Of course there's a pushback from Jordan. I've been involved in some of these conferences, similarly with Turkey, similarly with Morocco, with Indonesian organizations. But they cannot mask, so far, I hope they will, but so far they cannot mask the power, the resources which are arrayed against them. Currently, in the war of ideas within the Muslim world, the radicals are winning.
Paul Marshall. And now a closing statement from Edina Lekovic.
In the war of ideas, the moderates are the ones who have regained the ground since 9/11, both in internationally recognized leaders and in the feelings and the sentiments of the people on the ground. And it is those people on the ground, 1.3 billion of them, who dominate and define the religion of Islam, as do their recognized religious leaders who are, as we mentioned time and again, pushing for a new form of tolerance and more and greater dialogue with other religious institutions as well as state powers. Let us not confuse Islamic states and misunderstand them as anything other than the 2/3 of them that are dictatorships. The argument on the table is not whether the Muslim world is ruled by dictatorships. It most certainly is. But that is not the question on the table. The question is whether Islam itself, and therefore the global population of Muslims, are dominated by radicals. Radicals are failing in their attempt to dominate. The moral bankruptcy of the militants, as well as their abject failure in socioeconomic terms, has strengthened the leaders of moderate, predominantly Muslim nations, just like Turkey, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, in their struggle against religious radicalism and backwardness. Let us remember again the people on the ground who make up the dominant force within Islam and who have wrestled back control over their faith and are continuing to do so. Are they the absolute, the 100% at this point? Absolutely not. But they make up the dominant side, and they say, according to Gallup, that the most important thing that Westerners can do to improve relations with their societies is to change their negative views toward Islam and respect Muslims and Islam.